Ilford Hospital Chapel. Please we welcome Peter Haseldine.
Right, well, we'll go down to the end of the road and we shall wait for a 179 bus going to Ilford. And while we're waiting, we can, of course, admire the mock Tudor splendour of the Co-op and the 1930s parade, which comes next, which I noticed the other day says 1935 on one plaque and 1936 on the other. But anyway, we've come to get on the 179 bus, which helpfully says Ilford on the front, and that's where we want to go. So we get on that, and after about 40-45 minutes, we get to Ilford. And we get off at the stop called Ilford Station, we cross the road, and then we look down back what's called Ilford Hill towards London. Now, just so you can get your bearings, we're looking west here towards London. That's the North Circular there, which is elevated. And in the bottom of the valley there is the River Roding. And Ilford High Street is behind me. And on the left, you'll notice there's a complex of reasonably ancient looking buildings. So we'll go along there and see what it has to say for itself. Ah, here we are. Abbess Adelicia Charity, Ilford Hospital Chapel. Right, okay. Well, let's go in through the gate, see what we find. We find there's an old chapel on the right, which is what we've come to see. And there looks like an almshouse on the left. And there's an enormous block of flats has gone up behind it. If we look that's another view, just showing the almshouse a bit more. We'll come back and talk about the almshouses right at the end of the talk. And looking the other way, back towards London again, that's the almshouses on the other side, more blocks of flats. But we've come to see the chapel, which I say was built in 1145, and it's still there. And we're walking through the front door. Now, what I do, I'm one of the guides there, what I do is I sit people down, and before I take them around to show them what there is to see, I insist that they know the history of the chapel, why it's there, how it came to be, how it survived, why it looks like it does. Because if you don't listen to the history, you won't understand what we see when we walk round. So here we are, we're inside a Norman chapel, which stretches really from here to here. Built 1145 or thereabouts, rebuilt partially in the 14th century. In Victorian times, in the mid-1880s, an extension was built on the south side, which is that, but before then, that would have been a blank wall like on the northern side. When you're looking towards the altar, what you're looking at is what the Victorians thought you ought to be looking at if you went inside a suburban church in London. Let's just get the terminology right to begin with. It is a chapel and not a church. Now, if you look in the dictionary, it'll tell you that a church is any building that's used for Christian worship. The Church of England will tell you that a church is only a church if it has a parish. And as you'll hear, this building has never had a parish. It's only just a chapel. It's what they call in ecclesiastical terms a peculiar. Now, if we look the other way, turn through 180 degrees, we're now looking towards the west. So our Victorian extension is on the left and we're looking towards the west wall. But I'm going to sit you down here and tell you the history now. It all started, I say, we need to go back to Barking Abbey, which Jeff told us about earlier this year. And Barking Abbey, as far as we know, look, something like this. The original one was built of wood, built in 666 by Erkenwald, who was Bishop of London then. Burnt down by the invading Danes in 870, was rebuilt of stone in 970 and looked something like this. It was a Benedictine nunnery and it was a women's institution, whereas the previous Barking Abbey had been for men and women. This Barking Abbey, the second one, was a women's institution. It was run by women, for women, and being the Benedictine, it was mainly for the welfare of women. And of course, you don't need me to tell you about the abbey system that was in the country then. And really what it was, the king gave the church, and there was always rivalry between the king and the church. So the king gave the church some land to build abbeys. They in turn would pray for his soul. So it all worked. And the church really was put in charge of education, health, such as it was in those days. And the king did things like fighting the French or whoever we were fighting at that time. That was roughly how it worked. And abbeys were self-contained. They had their own farms and woodlands. So they all always had enough to eat, and the peasants had to pay their tithes, and that supported the abbey. So the abbey at Barking was a very important one. It was mainly because it was so near to London. It was in fact where William the Conqueror stayed for 6 months after he invaded, because the population of London was a bit upset about having been invaded by William the Conqueror. He stayed there for 6 months until it was safe for him to go to London and be crowned in 1067. Now, Barking Abbey, this is looking from north to south, which I always find confusing because I always think you should look from south to north. But if you look here, there's the River Thames, and the church there, St Margaret's Church, is still there to this day, as we'll see. But Barking Abbey was dissolved, almost quite literally, removed stone by stone in 1539. And as Jeff Page will have told you, that's roughly all there is to it today. If you go to Barking today, and if 29 people here haven't been to the Ilford Hospital Chapel, the chances are a fair number haven't been to Barking Abbey either. I'll show you what's there today so I can do the tourist bit for Barking. You've got St Margaret's Church on the left, and you've got the Curfew Tower on the right, and you come out the station, you turn right, and you walk through the market, and about 500 yards later you get to this complex, and you walk through the arch of the Curfew Tower, and you will get to the remains of the abbey, which I shall show you. There's the Curfew Tower. The sun came out for me. I made sure I was there in the winter so I didn't get leaves in the way of the photograph. And there's St Margaret's Church today, and as you saw from that drawing, the abbey would have been here while where we are standing. There's some very helpful interpretation boards, and if you go there on a Tuesday, Wednesday or Thursday lunchtime, in the refectory there, they do a very nice little, what I would call light lunch, sort of omelette and salad, that type of thing. And you can buy the guidebook, and you can also have a walk round Barking Church, which we'll also need to visit as part of our story. There's part of the walls of the abbey with the church coming up in the background. More walls of abbey and new flats in the back. Gives an idea of how extensive the abbey was. This excavation, all this was done in the 1920s, and when the new building is behind and next to be redeveloped, I'm sure some excavations will be done there as well. Anyway, enough of Barking. We've come to talk about the Ilford Hospital Chapel. Now, in 1145 or thereabouts, the abbess of the day was a lady called Adelicia, and she decided that she would make a name for herself, which she did, such as we're talking about her 800 years later. And at that time in the 12th century, there was a great spurt of church building. Most of the churches we have in this area, and by that I mean north and northeast London, were either built or extended rapidly in the 12th century. There was a ready supply of ragstone from Kent. There were teams of stonemasons touring the country, building cathedrals and all sorts of things like that. There was a great spurt of church building, and Adelicia decided that what was needed, Barking Abbey was caring for the welfare of women. What was needed, she decided, was somewhere to cater for the welfare of men. And so she built what we now know as the Ilford Hospital Chapel. The chapel was built of stone because that was the centrepiece, and that's why it survived. But there was the master, who was the admin man. There was the chaplain, who was in charge of religious affairs. Under him were 2 clergy, and they all looked after 13 old or infirm men. And they weren't necessarily old or infirm, but they were people who didn't have anyone else to care for them, and who it was thought worthwhile taking into care to be looked after. Adelicia dedicated the chapel to St Mary, as so many churches were in those days. Life started at the Ilford Hospital Chapel. Only it's never been a hospital in the sense that we know it today. It's always been hospice, of course. But what we have to say is, well, why did she build it there? I mean, why didn't she build it at Barking? Well, of course, we don't know. The earliest map, Ilford was a tiny community then. Ilford does not even feature in the Domesday Book. It's so tiny, it was just part of Barking. It was a small agricultural community. But the earliest map we have is this one of 1653, which shows the chapel, and you can see that Ilford is hardly very big there, 500 years after the chapel was built. But it's a mile away from Barking, and maybe they wanted to keep the men and women separate. Don't know. We do know that they commuted between the two on the River Roding, which was clearly navigable. On the other hand, it's on the main Roman road. This is the main Roman road from London to Colchester. So you'd always have a steady flow of passers-by. And Ilford's, about sort of 9 or 10 miles from London. If you're on a journey to Chelmsford or Colchester or wherever you're going, either to visit friends or family or on business or whatever, well, you might see a religious establishment and the journey was going to be hazardous with either horse and cart or foot. Well, why not stop and say a prayer to get some good wishes for your journey? And if people are going to say a prayer, well, they'll give you some money, won't they? So why not build the chapel there? It's quite plausible. The other thing that people say is, and especially when you go there, you'll see there is a plaque that says it was built for lepers. Now, there's no firm, conclusive evidence of that. There were 9 or 10 hospices built for lepers around Essex in the 12th century. We don't think this was one of them, but there is no doubt that lepers were accommodated because the records say so. Now, the thing about leprosy is that, of course, these days it's a medically defined condition. In those days, it was proper leprosy plus any other disease that nobody liked the look of. Don't like the look of him, he must be a leper, could be anything from a bad attack of eczema, something like that. Or he or she must be a leper, we'll steer clear of them. The Christian church got itself into a bit of a pickle about how to deal with leprosy, because some people said, well, if they're lepers, they must have sinned, so that's their just desserts. Other people thought, well, leprosy is so awful that they must be in purgatory, therefore they must be halfway to meeting God. Therefore, if you give a leper money to say a prayer for you, because the leper is nearer to God than you are, that money will go further, because the value of that prayer, you'll get through to God more quickly. It's a very convoluted reasoning, but it seems to be, anyway, the upshot of it all was, if you ran a leper colony, you got money and you got endowments and you got bequests, because people wanted to be nice to lepers, not necessarily for the sake of the leper, but because they thought it would do them good, because lepers saying a prayer for you would be good for your soul. Also, when some excavations were done a few years ago, 22 skeletons were found under the chapel, and so it's possible that there had been an incident of whatever type, we don't know, on that site, and it was felt appropriate to build a religious establishment there. Don't know, no idea, but it was built there. Now, interesting, the street pattern the same, is still pretty much the same. This is thanks to Mr. Google Earth. Here we are in the town centre of Ilford. There's the chapel. The railway's now being put in, but the street pattern's the same. All this sort of what is now a one-way gyratory. The 179 bus takes you to there. So what you've got to do is just walk over the road and you'll see it. Now, 25 years after Adelicia founded the Ilford Hospital Chapel, 1170, we have murder in the cathedral. Henry II hinted that, I know this is all greatly debated, but Henry II hinted it would be perhaps a good idea if Thomas à Becket was out of the way, because there was this old debate about the power of the church and the power of the monarchy, and Thomas Becket was thought to be getting a bit above himself, so wouldn't it be useful if he was got out the way? And 4 knights took it upon themselves to interpret his words that they wanted Thomas à Becket murdered, and they went down to Canterbury and they did so. End of Thomas à Becket. Now, his pre-internet day, I can't imagine what would have happened if we'd had the internet and Twitter and all the rest of it, but news of Thomas à Becket's murder spread throughout Europe like wildfire, and with it, he was canonised within 2 years. What a dreadful thing had happened. And of course, Henry II realised that he'd perhaps gone a bit too far, but it was a bit late then. And so what he did, and this was the advantage of having something like Barking Abbey, which was an all-female institution, he kept the Becket family quiet by appointing Thomas's sister, who was also called Mary, to be the Abbess of Barking. So, sorry I killed, sorry that Thomas got killed, but how about the top job in return? So that kept the Becket family quiet. And Mary, being now Abbess of Barking, she also dedicated the chapel in memory of her brother Thomas, and that is why the Ilford Hospital Chapel is dedicated to St Mary and to St Thomas. Now, we don't know much about what happened in the first 400 years because it was an awful long time ago and there are not many records, as you can well imagine. We do know, however, that history always repeats itself, and in 1397 there was calls for an audit to be undertaken, probably a whistleblower, as we would say today, and the audit was undertaken and it was found that instead of looking after 13 old men, they were only looking after 2 old men. So I wonder where the money was going. Nothing changes, nothing changes. I should have added that, of course, I said Barking Abbey was self-sufficient in its lands for its sources of income. And when Adelicia started the hospital chapel, she divided the land, she apportioned them between Barking Abbey and the Ilford Hospital Chapel, so that the hospital chapel was also self-sufficient. So peasants were paying their dues and tithes and whatever they paid to the chapel. And many of you will be familiar with Claybury Hospital, the tower that sits up on the hill over in the west somewhere. And Claybury Hospital sits on Hospital Hill. And it's not called Hospital Hill because the Claybury Hospital used to be on it. It's called Hospital Hill because it used to belong to Ilford Hospital Chapel. Now, you'll remember that even if you don't remember anything else I tell you tonight. The next thing the major thing that happened, of course, was the dissolution of the monasteries. Henry VIII got rather annoyed with the abbeys for having too much power and too much wealth, and he decided that they should be dissolved, quite literally, removed brick by brick, which is why we have remains of abbeys up and down the country. Barking was one of the last to be dissolved, And it was on the 14th of November 1539 that Lord William Peter, he of Ingatestone Hall, you've probably been to Ingatestone Hall or heard of it, and of course the Peter family still live there. And Lord William Peter was a very early civil servant. He was a Catholic himself, but he was totally a professional. And he went and he knocked on the door of Barking Abbey, and he was answered by the abbess, who was Dorothy Barley. And he knew Dorothy Barley because she was the godmother to his children. But he said, terribly sorry, got to dissolve your abbey because the king says so. And she was pensioned off with quite a nice pension. And I'm sure they remain good friends afterwards. But the second piece of useless information that you'll remember tonight, when you drive down the A127, perhaps on your way to Chelmsford or Southend, and you stop at the traffic lights by Goodmayes Hospital and you see Barley Lane, it's not because they used to grow barley in the area, it's because of Dorothy Barley. Right. Now, say history repeats itself, and after the dissolution of the abbey, of course, the hospital chapel was allowed to survive because it was not an abbey. It was certainly not rich like Barking Abbey. It didn't pose a threat to Henry. It was doing a good job looking after the old men, and also ever since it had been built, not only did it serve as a not only did the chapel serve for the old men, but it also acted as a chapel of ease for the local population. And so it saved the local population walking a mile to Barking to go to church on a Sunday. Which reminds me, I always forget something on these talks, and I'll no doubt forget more as I go along, but something about why Ilford was built where it was. I say it was a mile away, but if you go to Ilford today and you look towards Barking, all you see is rows and rows of Victorian houses, and Barking sort of over there in the distance somewhere. If you look there at 1145, when the chapel was built, you'd have seen Barking Abbey, a massive structure standing up in the marshlands. And so although it was a mile away, it wouldn't have seemed a mile away. It would have seemed much, much nearer. So perhaps it's not, perhaps psychologically it was nearer than perhaps we would think of it being today. The ecclesiastical property passed into the hands of the state, but think of privatisation. After 25 years, they got a bit bored with that. The king should be fighting wars and things like that, shouldn't be running little chapels in Ilford. So the idea was, someone hit on the idea that they would lease the chapel, get a lessee to run the place on their behalf. And users might say, well, who on earth would want to take on a lease where you've got the responsibility of looking after 13 old men? Well, the point was that you got all the income from the farmlands. You were allowed to keep the profit. So it was profitable once you'd got the lease. And also, when you went up there, when your time came, and they said, well, what have you done with your life? And you said, well, I looked after 13 old men in Ilford. Right, fast track to heaven for you. It was good for the soul to be the lessee of something like the Ilford Hospital Chapel. So the first lessee was Henry Fanshawe of Clay Hall. And he took on the lease, and 3 years later he assigned it to his nephew, Thomas, and Thomas was a far more astute individual. And Thomas renegotiated the lease such that instead of looking after 13 old men, he only had to look after 6. So more profit there. And the name of Fanshawe lives on in Barking today. There's Fanshawe Avenue. And if you go to the Fallance House Museum, which is a lovely little museum, the Havering Museum, you'll find an archive of portraits of the Fanshawe family, who were big landowners in the area for generations. Now, the lease passed on. It was bought by a succession of people. We know who they all were. Excuse me, in 1727, the lease was acquired by a fellow called Gascoigne, Sir Chris Gascoigne. Now he was a vintner. This is a window I found in a church in the city, in St Botolph's Aldgate, and there it says Sir Chris Gascoigne, brewer, and he was a vintner. He was the Lord Mayor from 1752 to 1753, and indeed he was the first Lord Mayor to live in the present Mansion House. Now, the point about Sir Chris Gascoigne is, oh, and by the way, his name lives on too. If you go to Barking, number 62 bus will take you to Gascoigne Estate. Now, what Chris Gascoigne did to have the Gascoigne Estate named after him, I don't know. But anyway, I could have thought of better places to be named after. But his name lives on. What Chris Gascoigne did of note was to get married. And we're back in Barking Church now, and we're looking to the memorial to him. And if we read it carefully, we see that he married the daughter of John Bamber, who was a doctor in Barking. He married Margaret Bamber. Now have a think about it. Chris Gascoigne marries Margaret Bamber. Getting a connection with names? They had a child, well, they had 3 children, but their first son they called Bamber Gascoigne. And there has been, or there was, a Bamber Gascoigne from then until the last one died earlier this year. And this is the fellow who used to do University Challenge and things like that. Regrettably, there's no children from the last Bamber Gascoigne. As far as we know, there's no nieces or nephews, which is a great pity because he used to be very helpful with his annual donations to the chapel. But that was Bamber Gascoigne, the originals. He was the original one. Now, Bamber Gascoigne renovated the chapel considerably. I mean, he was not short of money. If you can imagine, if your father is Lord Mayor of London, you've got a pretty good start in life. So the original Bamber Gascoigne renovated the chapel. He rebuilt the almshouses because, you know, the almshouses were built of wattle and daub or whatever, so they're always falling down and having to be rebuilt, and always falling down and having to be rebuilt. And one of the things that Bamber Gascoigne did was to, in accordance with the fashion of the day, instead of praying towards the altar, you look towards the preacher who stood in a gallery on the West End. So he had a gallery built, and here's a print taken from the gallery. Looking down, you can see the congregation in their box pews, all looking up to the preacher. Sorry about the light there, but I had to photograph it through glass. Now, I just put that one on just to remind you where you are every so often. The lease stayed in the Gascoigne family, but in 1821, the daughter of the second Bamber Gascoigne, she was called Frances Mary, she married Lord Salisbury. Now, there's always been a Lord Salisbury. It's the Cecil family of Hatfield House, which you may have visited. And so the title passed to Lord Salisbury. And believe it or not, the Ilford Hospital Chapel remained privately owned by a succession of Lord Salisburys, who were still looking after the 6 old men in the almshouses, until as recently as 1982, by which time it had all got a bit out of hand. Obviously, the farmlands had all got swallowed up with housing, Most of Ilford High Street was sold off by various Lord Salisburys along the way. He was losing money, and whilst it was still not just acting as a chapel of ease for the local population, I mean, it was de facto a parish church, and by the 1950s there were things like scouts groups and women's organisations attached to it, but it was all getting a bit out of hand. And I say he surrendered the lease in 1982, but what happened was, if you see, he acquired the lease in 1821. Well, Ilford was still rural then, very, very rural, but changes were coming. And when we get to the 1830s, which isn't much longer, the railways start coming, and not just Ilford, but the population of suburban London as a whole starts to boom. And the Church of England started to get worried, because certainly in Ilford you've got swathes of agricultural workers streaming off the land from East Anglia, settling in Ilford, getting work. You've got teams of Irish navvies building canals and railways, and the Church of England started to get worried, because the agricultural workers from East Anglia tended to be nonconformists and the Irish tended to be Catholics, and the Church of England was missing out. And so, not just in Ilford, but they embarked on a programme of church building in inner suburban London. And the the population of Ilford started to boom. The railway came in 1836 and the population boomed and never looked back. So the official Church of England church in Ilford opened in 1836 as well, I think. And this actually suited Lord Salisbury quite nicely, because Lord Salisbury was a high churchman. He was Anglo-Catholic, and he didn't really like what the Church of England, he thought they were a bit too plain and ordinary. So with the official Church of England opening down the other end of Ilford High Road, he could appoint chaplains for the chapel to his persuasion. And so he appointed in 1837 John Reynolds, who was a great exponent of the Tractarian movement of the Oxford Revival, back to the Catholic traditions, forget Henry VIII, they weren't Roman Catholic, they were English Catholics, but it meant that you had lots of sort of the accoutrements that went with Roman Catholicism. He could do what he liked, so he appointed a succession of high church chaplains, and that of course reflects itself in what we see in the chapel today. Because of the booming population, the south aisle that I showed you on the introductory picture was constructed merely to accommodate the booming congregation that they had then. And he surrendered the lease to the Church of England in 1982. Now, I think that's enough history for the moment. So what I'm going to do now is to take you on a tour of the interior, and I shall explain a bit more about the history as we go along. Now, we're now looking, you've been looking towards the chapel, towards the east window all the time. Now let's look a bit closer. For a start, notice the blue painted ceiling, which has got stars on it, which you might not be able to detect from here. John Reynolds, who was the Anglo-Catholic, the first chaplain appointed by Lord Salisbury, decided that was what was needed. Make it look like heaven. Let's have a blue sky and gold stars. And then let's have a look at the window that we've been looking at. Now the east window, I'm going to talk about when the south aisle was added. It must have taken some years to do, but they took the opportunity to generally reorder the church, which went on in churches up and down the country, to more like the Victorians thought a church interior should look like. So this window, the one that's been at the far end, this was a new stained glass window, technically stained glass, in 1885. And on the left we have St Mary, on the right we have St Thomas, the two saints of the chapel, and in the middle we have Christ. Underneath we have this reredos, which is of carved stone. Regrettably, we don't know who carved it because, like so many things, it was bought from a dealer. And they must have gone along with the measurements and said, well, you know, one of the reredos for this, what have you got? Well, how about this one? And it's a beautiful piece of carving, and it fits perfectly, but we don't know any more about it. Regrettably, we don't know who carved it. Now, looking at the east window from another angle, you'll see that on the left we have this window here, which we call the north window because it's facing north. Now, the thing about stained glass is if you know what you're doing, you can take it to bits like a jigsaw puzzle and reform it with bits of blank glass or taking bits of blank glass out. So when that window was put in there in 1885, this window was taken out of there and reassembled into here. Now, this is what we call the Gresham window, because on the left-hand side it has the coats of arms of the Gresham family, you know, the bankers in the city, Royal Exchange, all the rest of it. They were intermarried with the Ward family, whose coats of arms are on the right-hand side. What we don't know is why the window came to the chapel. It came here in 1751. The Greshams have no known association with the chapel. I think it's because it's the year before Sir Chris Gascoigne became Lord Mayor of London. They must have known the Greshams. They must have all known, well, you've got a chapel near, oh, how about a window? And this window came from one of the Greshams' homes in Surrey. We don't know any more about it than that, but what we do know is that the glass, not the roundels with the coats of arms, but the side bits of glass here, see these little fragments here, we've had these analysed by glass experts, and everyone's of the opinion that this is English painted glass of the 15th century. It is really very old and very special glass, and it's that rather, whoops, sorry, back we go, sorry. It's rather sort of uninspiring brown because that was the only paint that was available. It's translucent, it's painted on the glass, so it's not technically stained glass, whereas the coats of arms there are. So that's the glass you need to look at. That's the special bit. Now on the other side from the north window, surprise, surprise, we have the south window, which we also call the Flemish window. And we call it the Flemish window because very conveniently, if you look on the second roundel on the left, you'll see that under there it says Van der Balk 1550. And we know that Mr. Van der Balk had a glassworks in Antwerp, so we call it the Flemish window. Now, in the rearrangement, as I say, of the chapel in the 1880s to suit Victorian tastes, this window was bought from the church at Epping Upland. Oh no, Epping Upland, we don't mean Epping itself, we mean the little village, you know, the original Epping out to the west, which is still really just the church and a few farmhouses. This window was bought from Epping Upland Church in 1882, and Epping Upland Church don't know why, one, they sold it to us, or two, why they had a Flemish window in the first place. But it's the way that churches got reorganised, always appealed to a new market, new clientele. The roundels are of no significance at all to the chapel. They're just a combination of heraldic, coats of arms and biblical scenes, which could be used for teaching. Talking about the glass though itself, we had translucent glass on the north window. Here we've got glass from the 16th century made by our friend Mr. Vanderbilt, and it's moved up a stage in the technology. It's reflective glass. It's baked with silver oxide so that light reflects off it rather than through it, which of course is different again to the technically correct stained glass window which we saw on the east wall. Now moving just down from the altar there, we get this door to the vestry. Now, of course, the vestry didn't exist until the south aisle was put on in the 1880s, but that rather medieval looking door is what the Victorians thought a vestry door should look like, presumably. But of far more interest to us is the 6 rosettes across the top, because they almost certainly come from the original Barking Abbey. They must have been set aside by some locals and hidden and brought to light by the Victorians when they rearranged the chapel in the 1880s. Seen in a different light, it looks quite different. On the other side, we have the organ and the choir stalls. All this area was put in around, between about 1900 and the First World War, around that time. So in other words, when the Victorian alterations had been done, and so therefore people wanted to give money to renovate a bit more of the chapel and provide some more facilities. I want to show you the screen because this is a very ingenious device of Victorian heating. Those people who have been to the chapel will know how cold it is. The heating system in Victorian times was gas, which came up through these pipes here into these tridents, and the heat went up there, depositing around all over the ceiling and over all those paintings. Almost as useless as the present electric heaters we have, which, as you can see, are along the ceiling down. I mean, even I managed to learn at school that heat rises. So if you go there in the winter, you do get very cold feet. And over the other side there, we have the effigy. Now we're looking through now to the south aisle, which I say is a Victorian edition. So they had a blank wall. So they thought what they needed is an effigy. You've got to have an effigy, haven't you? Make it look like a proper cathedral or something. It is just that. It is in memory of a chaplain called, believe it or not, John Smith, who was obviously a decent fellow, and so decided to commemorate that to him. But it was bought from a dealer, and I always get this wrong, so I have to refer to my notes on this, but it just shows how experts can vary in that. Royal Commission for Historic Monuments says that the effigy is Victorian and the surround is 15th century. Council of Care for Churches says the effigy is genuine and the surround is much later. Pevsner says the whole thing's a puzzle. So we ended the first half by looking at the effigy, which looked through, you might have spotted it, into the Lady Chapel. Now, first half of the talk has been located entirely within the original Norman chapel. And I've mentioned the Victorian extension several times, but we're now standing in the Victorian extension, the south aisle, so you can now see how big it is. And I need to mention how the extension came about, because these things don't just happen. So the population of Ilford was expanding like anything. The congregation was getting bigger because a lot of people were happy with where they were going to church, and they didn't want to go to the official Church of England, which was about a mile down the road anyway. They were happy to stick with the hospital chapel. But it takes money to do these things, to build extensions. And you might have been to Valentine's Mansion. Yes. Gants Hill, you know, near Gants Hill. Good, lots of nods there. Very nice tea rooms there. I've recommended lunch in Barking. I can now recommend afternoon tea at Valentine's Mansion tea rooms. But in the 1870s, the Ingleby family were living in Valentine's Mansion, and Clement Ingleby was the patriarch, and he had a number of children, and as was the way in those days, one of them went into the church, his son Arthur. Now, whether strings were pulled or whatever, I don't know, but Arthur Ingleby ended up as being the chaplain of the Ilford Hospital Chapel at quite a young age. But with Dad's money and the son's enthusiasm, money was found for the building of the South Aisle. And being quite high church people, you couldn't just build an extension, you had to have a lady chapel. And this is it. This is what it looks like. And we've got the Virgin Mary sitting outside on a little plinth, which you remember the rosettes we saw over the vestry door around the corner. She is sitting on a plinth, which there again is thought to come from the original Barking Abbey. Now, the Inglebys, Ingleby built the south extension, complete with the Lady Chapel, and Arthur Ingleby was there from 1882 until 1892, which is when these works were undertaken. And I said, all very, very high church with all the accoutrements that go with that. Now, in the early 1890s, the Church of England was beginning to feel that it was getting a bit out of step with the times. I mean, Ilford was very, very prosperous. It's a suburb, very prosperous indeed, but you didn't have to go too far into East London from Ilford, and you came to some very poor living conditions and very bad poverty indeed. And the Church of England was beginning to, with the, not just, Dr. Bernardo had been around since the 1860s and 1870s, but I think it was the advent of photography that meant that people were made more aware of what desperate living conditions there were in the East End of London. Charles Dickens wrote about it, but when you looked at photographs of people in old courtyards and things like that, it brought it home to you that a lot of people were living in very poor conditions. And the Church of England really got wind of this and appointed a series of very low church vicars to East London parishes, whom it felt would be more in tune with the local population, more able to relate to them, or more relevant, the local population would be able to relate to them more easily, and that the church wouldn't be seen as being too wealthy and out of reach. Now, this zeitgeist rather must have filtered through to Lord Salisbury, even though he was a high church man. And after Arthur Ingleby moved on from being chaplain in 1892, they appointed another chaplain who was virtually a Roman Catholic. And I think Lord Salisbury realised he'd gone far too far and needed to reverse this, and so sought out a low church chaplain. And he appointed somebody with the wonderful name of Herbert Hensley Henson. And it's quite true, he's got his own Wikipedia entry. In fact, he went on to become an archbishop. Sorry, not an archbishop, just a bishop, but a bishop nonetheless. But Herbert Hensley Henson, and here he is, He had been the vicar at Barking previously, and by the age of about 30, he'd burnt himself out. He'd put so much vigour and verve into his sermons. He built up the congregation at Barking in an age when Barking was really quite working class and people not particularly interested in going to church. And he was appointed, Herbert Hensley Henson was appointed the chaplain at the Ilford Hospital Chapel. Well, he took one look at the Lady Chapel and decided this absolute nonsense. He closed it down immediately. There was a bigger statue of the Virgin Mary inside the Lady Chapel itself, and the story goes, and I've no way of verifying this, the story goes he put it in a wheelbarrow and took it round to the Roman Catholic Church, which was consecrated in 1896, just round the corner in the High Road, and said, I think you need this more than we do. And it's still there to this day. But what happened then was that Herbert Hensley Henson moved on in 1902. Yes, that's right. And the Lady Chapel stayed closed until after the First World War, when a local family, the Carters, were looking for some form of somewhere where they could commemorate some of their menfolk who had fallen in the war, and it was decided to reopen the Lady Chapel as a war memorial for the Carter family. Now, it reopened in the 1920s with its original furnishings. It's not used, I don't think it's ever been used as a chapel, but it looks all part of the scene, and we're very pleased that it's back with us and not boarded off anymore. So let's have a look at the Lady Chapel, because the reredos is a carving by Ninian Comper, noted, of course, for his being an architect, but he, being an artistic person, I suppose, he must have done some carving in his spare time, and he carved the reredos. The painting is a copy of part of a Caravaggio that's in the Vatican Museum and was donated by a local doctor to the Lady Chapel when it was opened by the Inglebys in the late 1880s. Now we're looking at, we can see the other side of the effigy that we saw from the chancel. There's another view of the Lady Chapel altarpiece. And there's the commemorative stone to the Carters, which is in the Lady Chapel. Now, if we turn through 180 degrees with the Lady Chapel behind us, we look down the far end and we see at the other end of the south aisle is our Burne-Jones window. We'll take a closer look at that. Now, Burne-Jones was a friend of the Inglebys, and so he was very pleased to, there was a price, but I'm not going to tell you what it is, because I know there is someone in the audience who gets very upset if you quote a value of money without putting it in the context of the time. So I'm looking at David Boot, and I would not dare say how much Burne-Jones charged for his window, but it was at cost price, but there's no point in saying how much it was. It was made in the William Morris factory, and it is a fine example of arts and crafts work. And we have many visitors who come to the chapel just to see this window. Here's a close-up of it. I mean, classic arts and craft, if you look at the way that the grass and the sky are interpreted. But it's dedicated surprise, surprise. I mean, if you are Clement Ingleby and you're living in Valentine's mansion and you've given a lot of money for this extension to be built, well, why not be commemorated by St Clement on the left and St Valentine on the right? And then people will remember you, won't they, and say, what a good fellow you were. You will remember that I said the original Bamber Gascoigne, when he renovated the chapel in the 1780s, built a gallery on the west wall. When the Victorians did their refurbishment, of course, they took that down because that wasn't needed, which then left them with a big blank wall. And so this rose window was put in, which is also arts and crafts. We're not entirely sure of who did this, but it's believed to be the work of Holiday, who was of the Burne-Jones school. It commemorates a young linesman, William Pickett, who drowned in the River Roding in 1890. I'm not quite sure whether it was an industrial accident or whether it was a group of lads larking around, but anyway, the poor fellow died in the River Roding in 1890 and was obviously thought highly enough that he should be commemorated with this window. Now, you might have noticed when we were looking back, this little inset on the north wall. About 25-30 years ago, English Heritage got rather upset about the rendering which was on the outside of the chapel because it wasn't allowing the stonework to breathe, and so some restorative work had to be done, and in doing so we discovered this Norman window, which of course nicely helps to prove the age of the chapel. Now, as we replace windows today, so you did then, as technology improved and you found you could support a greater area or width of wall with a larger aperture, well, you blocked up the little ones and replaced them with new ones. But the little apertures, this one has still survived. And if you look carefully under the arch there, you can still see traces of red and blue paint, because just because we tend to paint the walls of our churches white today, walls of churches in medieval times were painted to act as teaching aids for biblical scenes. They would have been very sort of cheerful and jolly places, and so this shows the red and blue. This shows the red and blue paint that was. Yeah. So this is to show that Norman window there. So you might not have noticed it, but you can see how it was replaced over the years by a much larger aperture, which was obviously much preferable because it let more light in, and so the old windows were boarded up and disappeared. Almost coming to the end now, but I need to show you this slab with the two rings on it. Now, if you lift this slab, and you would need a crane to do it, if you lift this slab, you can get down to the vault. And in the vault are some coffins. Now, imagine this is the one view I haven't got. Imagine you're standing where that gentleman in the blue shirt is back there. So you're looking back here. There's a step ladder down there from that slab we've been looking at, and he's down here with a torch, and here's all the coffins, and there's 65 of them, and they all date from the period 1820 to 1860. We know who the occupants are. This photograph is rather poor quality because it's a copy of a picture that appeared in a newspaper in 1956. Which was the last time anybody went down there. It's been sealed off ever since. There are no plans to unseal it. And so the coffins are down there, and you'll have to make do with that for a photograph. But that's what's under that slab. there's various plaques around the wall to show who the people were, and some people have bigger plaques than others, of course, depending on how important they were. And I'll now tell you a little bit about the almshouses, which, remember, we saw when we went in. This print is dated 1816, and this shows how the chapel was then. And it didn't have the bell turret that it has now. The almshouses were there, they looked like that. But bearing in mind we're down to 6 old men now, not 13. So that's the almshouses then. And then by the turn of the century, the master was living in this Victorian type house, which must have been quite new then. And there was a lich gate, and the bell turret has been added. But then in 1927, Ilford Hill, the road, was widened, and the lich gate and this Victorian house had to be demolished. And that's when the present almshouses were built. Perhaps I've got this in the wrong order a bit, but this is a watercolour by Andrew Bamford, who was a local artist who did a lot of paintings around the turn of the last century, around the Woodford and Ilford area. This is dated 1905, and this is the master's house as it was then, which is where, if you go there today, it's where the NatWest Bank is on the corner. So that's where the master's house was. That's what it looked like. And then we're back to the almshouses as they are today. So the road was widened in 1927, and so the decision was taken to completely rebuild the almshouses, blend them in with the chapel to make them look in keeping with the chapel. And so they are, well, exactly, I mean, it makes a nice little courtyard. There are, bearing in mind that that Lord Salisbury was looking after 6 old men at the end in 1982, there's I think 3 flats on one side and 4 flats on the other, the extra one being for the chaplain or live-in master, whoever it was then. Well, after Lord Salisbury surrendered the lease in 1982, it reverted to the Church of England, and they had to think of a use for the almshouses, and a number of charitable purposes were tried, but none were particularly successful. At one stage, a group of nuns lived in there. They were only there for about 18 months, but they seem to have made an awful impact in Ilford, because people always say to me, oh, how are the nuns getting on? Well, they haven't lived there for about 35 years, but they obviously made quite an impact. But that wasn't particularly satisfactory either. And so really for administrative convenience, the almshouses are leased to a housing association who in turn manage them for London Borough of Redbridge. So to cut a long story short, they're council houses. And if you're on the housing list for London Borough of Redbridge and it's decided that one of these little flats would suit your purposes, you might be allocated one. So that's where we are at the moment. And the funding of the chapel, I say, belongs to the Church of England, or rather, more directly, it belongs to a charity, the chief trustee of which is the Bishop of Chelmsford, and the income from the houses to the housing association, ultimately London Borough of Redbridge, pays for the upkeep of the chapel. That's roughly how it works, although it's a little bit mysterious in its own little ways. I think it's now time. I'm sorry we haven't weeded the front for you. It's time now to take you out through the front gate and back into the real world of Ilford High Road. We just walk to the right and round to the left, and there's a 179 going to Chingford station. And don't let it be said that Chingford Historical Society is not up to date. You can see I took this photograph after the Elizabeth line had started. So you've got the roundel up there showing it's the Elizabeth line. So it's very easy to get to the Ilford Hospital Chapel, door to door from Chingford. No excuse to all you 20-odd people who haven't been there. So the whole purpose of the chapel, believe it or not, is a religious establishment. It still is. There is a weekly service on Thursdays at 12:35. Don't ask me where the 35 comes into it. I can only assume that someone had a lunch hour at 12:30 and it took them 5 minutes to get there. I don't know. But anyway, there is a weekly service at 12:35. This is because it's still a chapel. It's not a church. And it does not want to be seen to be competing with the proper Church of England in Ilford High Road. So it does not have services on a Sunday. And I say the days when, although it was still a chapel, you used to have scout groups and women's groups and things like that, they are long gone. The congregation, I'm afraid, is dwindling alarmingly, which you might think is not surprising in view of the change of the demographic of Ilford. The chaplain who's there at the moment, previously the chaplain was a retired clergyman who could give more time to the chapel, but the present chaplain, he has a parish in Dagenham, and this is just one of his many functions. So although he gives as much time as he can to the well-being of the chapel and its communicants, I'm afraid he doesn't have as much time as he would like. We are, I regret to say, very rarely open to the public. If you want to come along to a weekly service, you would be most welcome, I can assure you. Doors open at about 12 and they close at about 2, and there's always tea and coffee available, so you can pop in then. On the other hand, we are having a winter bazaar on Saturday, the 26th of November in the morning. The trouble is, whilst I shall be there and the other guides that we have, there will be sort of Christmas stalls and things like that. So you won't see some of the interior as clearly as you've seen them in my photographs this evening. And then next year we'll re-embark on our series of open days, which is not exactly frequent. I think it's something like every other month. But we are open, so we'd be very pleased to come and see you. We'd be very pleased if you would be able to come and see us. And I think that's all I can tell you today about the Ilford Hospital Chapel. And I hope that all those 20-odd people who hadn't heard of the place will come along and see us, if only from the outside. Oh, sorry, Jerry.
Peter, thank you very much.
Sure.
Right, hold on to that. Hold on to that. Okay, so we're going to open up the questions for you, Peter. Does anyone here have any questions for Peter? One lady over there, one moment. Dorothy.
I know you said you knew who were in the coffins.
Yes.
But you didn't say who they were, where they came from. I just wondered who they were.
I would have to go and refer to the list. They were notable people in the area who regarded the chapel really as their main place of worship. I say not the official Church of England. They were people from 1820 to 1860 who were happy to continue with the High Church and its rituals that were at the chapel.
Anyone else? One moment.
Yeah, really interesting and absorbing talk, Peter. I shall certainly be paying the Ilford Hospital Chapel a visit. My question is, do you think there's a bit of it's paradoxical that the early history, sort of from 1145 onwards, even though the population was lower in Ilford, I mean, as it was everywhere, that there was more interest paid in the chapel, and does this owe something that's lacking in today in the modern age, that we're not kind of marketing, properly, places of historical interest that, for example, would fit into visitors, like tourists or schools, for example?
Well, this is debated. Sorry, yeah. This is an age-old debate. The chaplain here, who his view is, and I can't argue with this, yes, it's a historic building, but his main job is to look after the spiritual well needs of his parishioners. The fact that it's in a historic building, I mean, I can't think of any other. I was an accountant, but if I'd had to look after the building I was in as a historic monument, I would say, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be working as an accountant. It's very difficult. I fear for talking off the record, I fear for the long-term future of the chapel, I must say. But if it were to be turned into an arts centre, well, I would lose interest, full stop. It just wouldn't have the same appeal. And I speak as someone who isn't religious at all.
Yeah. Any other questions for Peter, please?
Just one thing.
Yes, one moment, madam.
Nothing to do with the actual chapel, but if anyone's read The Warden by Anthony Trollope, that's about a foundation very similar, where a few old men were supposed to be looked after.
Yes.
It's worth a read.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Any more questions for Peter? Any more? Do we have anything online? Nothing online. A quick question then. The chapel, you've raised a question that not sure about its future. Is the building listed?
Grade 2 star.
Grade 2. Okay.
Star.
Star.
Grade 2 star.
Star. What does the star mean?
The star means it's extra special.
Right. Okay.
It got the star when the Victorian flooring was renovated by the altar. It was grade 2 until then, and then about 10 years ago we got the star.
Fantastic. Okay, well, look, a fascinating talk. Peter, thank you very much for coming along this evening for that. And you've still got some books there, is that right?
Yes.
And they're £4.50, is that right?
£4.50, yeah.
Okay, may well purchase one myself. Let's have one last round of applause for Peter. Thank you. Great, thank you very much.